May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. And let the church say,
Amen.
Well, I don't know about you, but for me, this seems like a good time for a gospel that explores compassion fatigue, or just fatigue in general. I find that I am exhausted. I don't mean as in I didn't get enough sleep last night. I mean weary. And I'm betting that many of you are too, for reasons that might range from personal health struggles to anxiety about the survival of democracy. I don't mean to stress anybody out, but it's not like it's not on all of our minds anyway. After putting it off for many months, I'm finally going to take a sabbatical this fall. I'm not sure I really know how. I've never had one. But honestly, my vocation and ministry isn't what's wearing me out. Y'all aren't the reason I'm tired. Nor are the community partners and organizers with whom I share ministry during the week. It's the other stuff all around me that seems to be broken, things that aren't really directly related to my job as a faith leader. And like many of you, I also carry some pretty heavy family responsibilities. I'm at that stage in life where I'm caring for the generation above me and the one beneath me. But it's still worth taking a pause, I know, and even if I can't leave behind the things that actually generate a lot of the exhaustion. Anyway, I mention this because that relentless exhaustion is a powerful undercurrent in today's gospel. In particular, the tension between that weariness to the bone and our compassion. The apostles had no leisure even to eat. We've all had those days, right? You're like, oh, that's 3:30 and I haven't had time to have lunch. But these guys have been going town to town, casting out demons and healing the sick for days, maybe weeks. These apostles need some downtime. They need a sabbatical. And we hear that Jesus is trying to help them get one. He says, come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while. But as soon as they try to slip away in the boat, the people recognize them and they chase them on foot to this deserted place, which, now that they've been joined by thousands of people, is no longer a deserted place. I picture them like a few yards offshore in a boat while the people are sort of running along the shoreline. Hey! Now, I know that we've got quite a few shepherds in the house. Perhaps you're a parent, a leader in the workplace, a teacher, or just someone that on a regular basis hears that, hold up, I need to speak with you. When everyone wants a piece of you, needs something from you, perhaps off in the distance, you can see that wonderfully deserted place. You fantasize about putting your feet up, pouring that cup of tea or glass of wine. Oh, you were so close. It was not to be. And I kind of wonder if that's how the apostles felt. And I also wonder if Jesus was exhausted and hungry like the rest of them. But he's trying to find that respite for them. But then he sees a great crowd of people, desperate for healing and connection, and they're crowding around him from all sides. And he has compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. That compassion burns within his sacred heart, and he wades right back into the sea of humanity. The Gospel of Mark has an urgency to it. The crowds just keep coming, creating an almost claustrophobic pressure around Jesus. They have not been cared for by their own political leaders, who have failed as shepherds. And they need that love and care, and they have finally found someone who can bring it. The phrase, sheep without a shepherd, often appears in the Hebrew scriptures, like we just heard in Jeremiah, in situations where God is taking to task the abusive shepherds, those who do not properly care for their sheep. As their rabbi and teacher, Jesus was likely comparing King Herod, who we heard all about last week, to those historically abusive shepherds that the prophets warned the people about in his own sacred texts. Herod, as we recall, between, the beheadings and the killing sprees, sat in the lap of luxury while the people went unfed and uncared for. Jesus' compassion for the people is in part meant to be a contrast and a response to the neglect of the people by their so-called leaders. More than a few New Testament scholars, in particular Caroline Lewis and Eric Barreto, discuss this phenomenon of compassion, pondering its theological meaning and its role in our lives. The Greek word for compassion has its roots in a word that means guts, the core of one's feelings, what we refer to as feeling it in your gut, that twinge when you sense it physically, almost primitively. That's compassion. It's a visceral feeling. And Jesus' deep compassion is triggered when he sees how lost we are, lacking guidance, lacking someone to love us, in need of care, of protection, of healing. But for Jesus, compassion isn't just a feeling. It's also a doing, like feeding the 5,000 and wading back into the sea of people. Jesus had to show his apostles and all of his followers in the crowd that compassion and then acting on it is inherent to discipleship. Much like the foot washing on Maundy Thursday, do as I do. Jesus is teaching them and us that the twinge, that feeling in your gut, that deep feeling, won't go away until you let it travel into the spaces that need it, and at times need it desperately. And notice what is happening beyond his inner circle of apostles. The people who are in need are bringing other people who need him even more. Mark writes that people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. Jesus' compassion and selflessness is spreading. People not only want it for themselves, they are literally carrying their infirmed neighbors to see him. My friends, and especially my family, are a job that I cannot leave. And while Jesus could probably have used a sabbatical too, the whole human family is his job, and it's one that he will never leave. I'm sure many of you have heard of compassion fatigue that I referenced earlier. It's how psychologists describe the gradual lessening of compassion over time, and it's common among those who repeatedly work directly with victims of disasters, trauma, illness. I personally worry and pray so much for doctors and nurses in places like Gaza and Ukraine and their repeated exposure to unspeakable horrors, especially when it involves children. When you read Mark's gospel all the way through, there are lots of times when you can sense that the apostles are struggling with their own compassion fatigue. Some, particularly in our time and place, might write off this passage as a terrible example of self-care. And don't get me wrong, we are human and we need our sleep, and God created the Sabbath for us in the beginning of Genesis. God commanded us to rest. But maybe this gospel lesson can reveal something useful and even holy about the role of fatigue, how this deep weariness might relate to hope and transformation. I think that in this gospel story, Jesus causes our relationship with fatigue to change. As the disciples get their needed rest, and they do eventually, Jesus' persistent and tireless grace heals all who come to him, even those who merely touch the edge of his cloak. Just imagine how exhausted the people in the crowds must have been. Is it possible that I have misunderstood the meaning of all this weariness that I'm feeling? Have I misunderstood why I feel so tired when the forces of hate and violence seem to be marching on despite my efforts to stop them? What if weariness is part of both suffering and hope? What if weariness is not just a path toward resignation, but the way Jesus heals us anew? What if weariness does not drain our faith, but strengthens it? What if weariness is a sign of hopefulness? What if the kind of weariness that emerges from us in the midst of infuriating and exhausting injustices is the very place where God meets us in our laments. Perhaps our weariness is the reflection, as in a mirror, of Jesus, the Jesus who cries out from the agony of the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Even Jesus, for a moment, felt abandoned. Perhaps this weariness and despair is part of our deep connection to Jesus. If that is true, then our fatigue is not the end of our call to love and heal the world. It's the beginning. Having worked alongside many amazing warriors during my nearly 20-year legal services career, I can attest that weariness is the constant companion of those who fight for justice. But our God seeks justice with us and for us. And Jesus' compassion is without borders. So then our faith, whether we are dancing or weeping, energized or exhausted, will never be empty with a God like that. It might be worth asking ourselves, how do we cope with the weariness that accompanies tragedies in our life and in the lives of others? And where do we find motivation for continuing the faithful work of justice when we feel the least hopeful? As I said earlier, maybe the only way to cure that pain in your gut that sparks compassion is to act on it, to do something in response to it, as Jesus taught us. Action might be the best medicine for that ache that you sometimes feel in the pit of your stomach. Half the time, we don't even know where our strength comes from. But the Good Shepherd has shown his love for me and for you in times when we weren't even aware of it. We may look back at times in our lives and say, how did I get through that? How did I even get out of bed in the morning? But the Spirit carried us, and an inexhaustible Jesus kept turning toward us with compassion, kept healing, and kept shepherding us when we felt lost. While Jesus walked on this earth, compassion pervaded his life and ministry, no matter how weary we are, how cranky we are, or how defeated we may feel. I'm really thankful that the compassion of Jesus does not wear thin. And in those moments when we feel the most like sheep without a shepherd, those are the most holy moments, because that state of fatigue and suffering places us right at the foot of the cross. Amen. Our compassion, and at times our fatigue in response to it, those two things together can bring us to that very place where we are more fully present with God. Amen.
Amen.